Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier. You know, there's a lot to consider in properly evaluating the New Deal. Too much for any one single answer. Though what you decide to include in a potential question will most often depend on the question you face. You may of course face a very general, open question. And in this case, you have to select options that you feel will give you the best chance for big marks. There is Roosevelt's own focus on relief, recovery and reform to help your structure. There is of course the all-important factor of unemployment. You might also think about the impact the New Deal had on the biggest of the different key groups in America, the farmer, the industrial worker, women, African Americans, and the newer immigrants. And maybe you shouldn't forget Native Americans. And you might decide to use the 1937 recession and the impact of World War II. Now, that's a lot. But in this presentation, I aim to show you just how you can shift the same knowledge in the direction of very different potential questions. I have to say, it's the kind of thing I do in my tutorials, which is something you might want to consider. But let's get going with this presentation. And I'll start with this potential question. How far did the New Deal achieve its aims? Explain your answer. Explain every answer for questions B as well as questions C. That's where the big marks lie. Well, for this one, paragraphs focusing in turn on relief, recovery and reform with a balance in each, and that balance can be tipping one way or the other, seems to provide the basis for a very good answer. And you can use examples of how the New Deal affected different Americans for better or worse. For example, how far were the unemployed given relief with temporary jobs? Or how far were homeowners or farmers given relief with their mortgage payments? With recovery, you could focus on the stubborn problem of unemployment. And with reform, well, was capitalism saved by tightening the regulations on banks and the stock exchange? How effective were union reforms or welfare reforms? And there is the completely open question. The New Deal was a success. How far do you agree with this statement? As I've said, these questions allow you to head to your strengths, the bits you know most about. But they are actually the hardest to structure because nothing is suggested in the question itself. I would again go back to Roosevelt's aims, relief, recovery and reform, using examples of how the New Deal affected different Americans for better or worse. But I would make sure there was a paragraph on unemployment, and I would make sure that I have a rural example as well as an urban one. And do note how I'm already repeating points. Now let's take a more specific question, which helps your structure. How far did the New Deal solve America's economic problems? I would focus on two sets of problems, and actually on two economies. The economy of unregulated companies, for example the trusts, the unregulated stock market, and unregulated banks, and the economy as it affects people, paying mortgages or rent, affording food and other basic needs. And so I would focus on immediate relief and then recovery in the form of jobs, but also reforms such as making farms and homes safer and strengthening trade unions, You see, again, I'm repeating points. You would use farmers and workers as examples, but don't forget you can give a brief line or two on African Americans, Native Americans, or the more recent immigrants. Republicans, of course, argued that Roosevelt only weakened what had made America strong: free enterprise and rugged individualism. The main weakness of the New Deal was that it did not do enough to help the poor. How far do you agree with this statement? Well, here I would focus on the poor tenant farmer, the sharecropper, the poorest paid workers. But there is the poor African American, often the poorest paid worker, and the poor immigrant to consider too, and poor women, 50% of the population. And you can bring in the criticisms made by Huey Long and Father Coughlin. There were the stubborn unemployment levels, there was limited welfare reform, and limits to the help given to farmers. But there were the measures to provide immediate relief and then recovery. Unemployment did improve, and the TVA did seek to help a particularly poor region. There must always be balance in your evaluations. Another social issue with another clear focus. The greatest failing of the New Deal was that it did not end racial discrimination in American society. How far do you agree with this statement? Was relief adequately focused on racial minorities? Were job creation schemes? And don't forget, we are considering the poor recent immigrants and Native Americans, as well as African Americans. But there could also be a strong focus on reform. There must be balance in your work. But let me just remind you of three things. Other than for Native Americans, the needs of African Americans or the more recent immigrants were not specifically targeted. Segregation still existed, indeed was employed in the CCC camps and in the TVA, and Roosevelt did not pass an anti-lynching law. Now the big issue. How effective was the New Deal in dealing with unemployment? Strong focus on job creation, both temporary and immediate, and for the long term. I'm not going to go over the debate here, but you really have to prepare for this one more than any other. And whilst the 1937 recession might show that priming the pump had worked, the impact of World War II was what really got America back working. Also, though there were clearly shortcomings, and most jobs created were temporary, think of those infrastructure projects in the PWA and the TVA, which had a long-term impact. They were not insignificant. Now you might get the kind of question that sets one group against another. For example, who did the New Deal help more, farmers or the unemployed? It's the kind of question where I would offer 4 separate paragraphs, plus and minus factors for farmers and the same for the unemployed. But you might also want to think about immediate relief and longer-term solutions, and reforms so that they wouldn't be in this position again. And let me use this potential question to remind you that you always need to answer the question: was it farmers or the unemployed? It only takes a sentence, but it will cost you a mark if you don't, and every mark is precious. And do prepare for the other groups that could be used in this type of question. Native Americans, African Americans, the more recent immigrants, and women, 50% of the population. And so I'll end on what could look like a tricky question. The most important achievement of the New Deal was that it restored Americans' confidence in their government. How far do you agree with this statement? And the issue of confidence might seem a tricky concept for you. It seems a difficult question, but so long as you focus on confidence, you can score very well. Think about things like the impact of the first 100 days and the way it must have lifted Americans' morale, and of Roosevelt's fireside chats. Did he look after the forgotten man? Or you could contrast America before the New Deal. Was it close to revolution? The riots, the protests, not least the Bonus March, with the election of 1936, when Roosevelt was swept back into power. Though don't forget there was opposition to Roosevelt, from the left as well as from Republicans. Another approach is that you could contrast the issue of confidence with the pragmatic side of the New Deal, immediate relief and longer-term focused reforms. Now you'll find more detail in my ebooks on Amazon, and I would say that the price of the compilation book there, that's the one with all 4 topics, I think is a bargain. But there's also my website, History Made Easier, and of course my other presentations that will have more detail than you find here. This one is about structuring your answers, something, as I said at the beginning, we do in tutorials. But enough of the sales pitch. As I often say, if the examiner sees you thinking about the question and thinking about history, you'll get your reward in A-star heaven. I do hope this has been useful for you, and I do thank you so much for listening. The very best of luck with your studies. Cheers.